Before we dive into this extraordinary journey, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us bring more untold stories from the shadows of history. There are stories the world tries to forget, names carefully scraped from the pages of chronicles, faces erased from family portraits, and memories reduced to little more than whispers echoing through ancient halls. This is one of those stories. The tale of a man who should have remained invisible, a miller's son with no right to stand among the mighty, let alone be mistaken for one of their own. Yet he did more than simply blend in. He sat at their tables, whispered in the ears of princes, and some claim nearly took his place among the architects of history itself. His name, Jacques Arnay, or, as he came to be known, Jean de Beaumont. He was not a king, nor a noble, nor even a man of learning, at least not by birth. But what he achieved sent ripples of fear and awe through the highest echelons of France. For Jacques was not just a fraud, he was a mirror, a living, breathing question mark carved into the heart of a society obsessed with bloodlines and legitimacy. His story, once nearly obliterated by those he outwitted, now returns from the mists of the past, demanding to be heard. Tonight, we'll resurrect a legend. We'll sift through the dust of forbidden documents, piece together forgotten rumors, and enter the world of the greatest impostor medieval France ever saw. This is not just a tale of deception. It is a meditation on the meaning of status, the fragility of identity, and the hidden power of the outcast. The middle of the 14th century was a time of darkness for France. The country staggered under the triple burden of endless war, famine, and a plague that swept away entire generations. The 100 Years' War raged ceaselessly. Towns and villages vanished in smoke and blood. Across the countryside, fields lay untended, families scattered, and hope flickered like a candle in a storm. The old order, rooted in the unshakable faith that blood alone defined worth, was cracking. Nobles huddled in their fortresses, obsessed with their lineages and bitterly defending shrinking domains. The church, once a pillar of unity, now often fanned the flames of fear and suspicion. In the shadows, bandits and mercenaries preyed on the weak, while ordinary people clung to whatever scraps of security they could find. For the majority, life was a grim cycle of toil and hunger, with no ladder to climb and no exit to dream of. A peasant was born into mud and labor, lived in anonymity, and died unnamed, a speck beneath the notice of the mighty. Social mobility was a fantasy, birth was destiny, and no amount of talent could shift the scales. In this world of locked gates and invisible walls, one child was born whose hunger would not be sated by bread alone. His name was Jacques Arnay, and from his first breath, he seemed to carry an ache for more, for meaning, for knowledge, for a place in the story denied to people like him. Jacques was born in the heart of Normandy, the second son of a village miller. His earliest memories were of cold dawns, coarse bread, and the relentless rhythm of work. By the age of 6, he was already hauling sacks and cleaning grindstones. At 10, he could go a whole day without a word, learning that silence could be armor as much as weapon. Poverty was more than a lack of coins or comfort. It was a fence around the mind. In Jacques' world, books were almost mythical, education the privilege of priests and petty nobility. He would sometimes sit for hours near the church doors, straining to catch snatches of Latin he did not understand, gazing in awe at the painted saints, wondering what secrets might be written on the priest's precious parchments. His mother prayed for strength. His father grumbled about debts and weather, but Jacques learned to look and listen. He studied the faces and hands of travelers, merchants, even the rare noblemen who passed through the village. He learned which words opened doors and which ones got you beaten. Above all, he learned that in a world ruled by walls, the key was knowledge. Not just facts, but the ability to see patterns and mimic them. Dreams began to flicker in his mind, not of gold or castles, but of slipping through those cracks in the world, of becoming someone else, of stepping across the line that divided the invisible from the unforgettable. The turning point came when Jacques, by chance, helped the village notary retrieve some scattered papers during a sudden gust of wind. The notary, an irritable, lonely man, was so impressed by the boy's nimbleness and sharp eye that he took Jacques on as a helper. At first, the work was menial, sweeping floors, lighting candles, fetching water, but the boy's eagerness was infectious. Bit by bit, the notary taught him the shapes of letters. Jacques' hands trembled the first time he held a quill, but the world of ink and parchment opened like a forbidden garden. He learned not just to write, but to imitate the fluid signatures of the gentry, the curt, precise notes of merchants, and the elaborate greetings of churchmen. It was here that Jacques glimpsed the real power in society, not swords or birthright, but the silent authority of documents. A single written order could change lives, redistribute land, pardon a criminal, or start a war. He marveled at how people bowed to the stamp and seal, no matter who bore them. Soon he became invaluable, copying letters, drafting receipts, listening closely to every client's plea. But most of all, he learned the art of invisibility. Nobody noticed the quiet boy in the corner. Nobody wondered how much he heard or what he remembered. Jacques stored every detail away. He could read people as easily as parchment, sensing when a lie was needed or when silence served better than truth. In those dim, candle-lit rooms, Jacques understood. The difference between a peasant and a noble could be as thin as a scrap of vellum or a single forged signature. The notary's office became Jacques' secret school, a university of human nature and institutional weakness. He observed how the most powerful men in the region sometimes stammered before a well-worded letter, how a single phrase could tip the scales in a lawsuit, and how quickly fortunes shifted when old records resurfaced. He grew adept at mimicking not just handwriting, but entire personas. If a letter required sorrow, he could imbue his script with pathos. If it called for anger, his words grew sharp and biting. More than anything, he realized that what most people saw as fixed and holy, the written word, could be twisted, repurposed, or created out of nothing. It was not long before Jacques was writing entire documents for the notary, learning the intricacies of feudal law and local politics. He began to imagine what it might be like to wield such influence himself, not from behind someone else's desk, but as a master of his own story. Then, one dawn, he simply disappeared. No note, no warning, just a silent departure from everything he had known. The village barely noticed his absence. A helper gone, nothing more. But for Jacques, this was his first true step out of the world he was born into, and into the one he intended to conquer. Elsewhere, in another town, a mysterious young man would soon arrive. He carried with him a battered satchel, a practiced smile, and a new name. His old life was gone, replaced by the first lines of a new legend, one that would shake the very foundations of the world that had always ignored him. When Jacques left the notary's house, it was as if he vanished into thin air. No one in the village cared to ask where he'd gone. The mill turned, the days passed, and his absence was a footnote at best. But for Jacques, this disappearance was a conscious rebirth. He traveled on foot, sometimes begging for food or a place to sleep, always keeping his eyes open and his ears sharper still. On the road, he encountered a world both wider and crueler than he'd imagined. Bandits lurking in forests, suspicious townsfolk, itinerant monks with tales of war and plague. Every night, alone by a campfire or huddled in a barn, he rehearsed his story. He practiced new names, different accents, different ways to stand and walk. He watched people, how they laughed, how they argued, what they feared. By the time he reached a new market town, Jacques Arnay was gone. In his place stood someone else, quieter, more confident, with a mind already set on climbing higher. He was ready to be anyone except himself. In a bustling northern town, a stranger appeared during the spring fair. He wore second-hand clothes, but carried himself with the dignity of someone who expected respect. His voice was calm, his gaze unflinching, and when asked his name, he answered, "Jean de Beaumont, son of the late Seigneur de Beaumont of Picardy. I seek what is owed to my family, lost in the chaos of war." He carried with him a battered scroll, supposedly a letter from a distant uncle, and a makeshift ring with a crude coat of arms. Most importantly, he brought a manner of speaking that was just educated enough to hint at noble origins, but humble enough to avoid suspicion. Jean did not ask for charity. He offered conversation and insight. At the local inn, he kept to himself, but listened to every word around him. On Sunday, he knelt at the front of the church, attracting curious glances from the townsfolk. Soon enough, rumors spread. "He must be a lost heir," said some. "He's suffered, but he's one of us," said others. Jean de Beaumont's legend had begun, not through grand declarations, but through the quiet weaving of a story people wanted to believe. In medieval France, paper was power. Seals and signatures opened doors, changed fortunes, settled arguments. Jean understood this instinctively. He spent nights in candlelight, carefully imitating the handwriting of notaries and church scribes, creating ancestral documents, family trees, property grants, old letters from imaginary relatives, his forged crest borrowed from patterns seen in dusty church tapestries, just believable enough to pass. Each document was more than a lie. It was a key, a piece of armor. Jean showed them sparingly, only when someone important needed convincing. He never boasted, never tried to dazzle. Instead, he let the artifacts do the talking, and let the townsfolk fill in the rest. The result was magical. With every scrap of parchment, every improvised seal, Jean's invented identity grew stronger, harder to question. No one had the resources to investigate deeply. After all, war and plague had swept away so many records. If the stranger said he was a Beaumont, who could prove otherwise? Jean's careful performance did not go unnoticed. The local reeve invited him to dinner, impressed by the newcomer's polite manners and subtle insights into law and faith. During meals, Jean rarely dominated the conversation. Instead, he listened closely, contributing just enough wit and charm to leave a good impression. Soon, other notables sought his company. A merchant hoping to resolve a dispute, a priest wishing for a Latin tutor, a minor baron eager for news of the capital. At a banquet held for the town's most influential families, Jean found himself seated near the Lord Steward. When an argument broke out over a property line, Jean calmly cited ancient precedents he'd memorized from notary records. His confidence, paired with just enough humility, won the steward's trust. Before long, Jean was given a small room in the manor, a place at the table, and most importantly, a role in local affairs. He had entered the elite not by force, but by quietly offering what they lacked and making himself indispensable. What truly set Jean apart was not his forged papers or borrowed crest, but his uncanny ability to read people. He never bragged, never pressed his advantage. Instead, he seemed to know just when to speak and, more crucially, when to remain silent. His humor was dry, his compliments rare, but perfectly timed. He listened intently to old men's stories and remembered details others forgot. He showed deference to the proudest matron and curiosity toward the youngest apprentice. To the priest, he quoted scripture. To the merchant, he discussed profits and losses. To the knight, he spoke of honor and loyalty. It was as if Jean became, for a moment, whatever the person before him needed most. The town soon buzzed with talk. He's not like other nobles. He understands us. Invitations multiplied, and his name began to carry weight in the region. Jean de Beaumont, once a shadow in a notary's house, was now the center of a growing circle of influence, and the foundations of his new life were set. As the months passed, Jean refined every detail of his performance. He studied the nobility with the intensity of an apprentice, observing how they greeted each other, the subtle gestures at the dinner table, the calculated pauses in conversation. In the mirror, he practiced the precise nod of acknowledgement, the gentle but firm handshake, the small smile reserved for equals. His efforts paid off. At social gatherings, even the most suspicious barons began to accept him as one of their own. Jean knew when to offer a toast, when to let a story end in laughter, and when to quietly excuse himself from a heated debate. He never overplayed his hand. Modest in his claims, yet confident in his demeanor, he radiated a quiet authority that could not be faked by mere words. His transformation was so complete that to many he seemed the very model of a new kind of nobility, one built not solely on blood, but on mastery of the rules and rituals of elite society. Jean understood that acceptance by the church was as important as approval from the gentry. When he was invited to join a major religious celebration, he saw it as a critical test. He spent weeks observing local priests, memorizing the order of service, and practicing the intricate movements of Mass. He learned the prayers in Latin and recited them with care, never too perfectly, lest anyone suspect he was more scholar than noble. On the day of the festival, he made sure his humility was on display. He knelt at the right moment, crossed himself with quiet dignity, and gave a generous offering to the poor box. The parish priest, impressed by his devotion and apparent understanding of Scripture, praised him before the congregation. The Beaumont family always upheld the faith. The endorsement was worth more than any document. With the blessing of the church, Jean's reputation was no longer merely tolerated. It was celebrated. He became, in the eyes of many, a symbol of true, pious nobility. This new legitimacy opened doors that had previously been barred and silenced even the most stubborn critics. The local baron, seeing Jean's growing influence, introduced him to Count de Chartres, a figure of real power and scrutiny. The Count was known for his sharp wit and suspicion toward social climbers. Their first meeting was a dinner marked by formalities and veiled questions. The Count tested Jean with references to old family histories and subtle jokes about provincial upstarts. Jean, however, was prepared. He replied with clever, humble stories about childhood in the shadow of the Picardy woods, always careful not to contradict himself, always hinting at the hardships of a family devastated by war. Impressed by Jean's composure and lack of arrogance, the Count gradually warmed to him. By the end of the evening, Jean had been invited to remain at the estate for further discussions about the region's future, an honor reserved only for those truly considered part of the elite. This connection was transformative. With the Count's trust, Jean's social position solidified. He had moved from a tolerated outsider to a welcome confidant, a man whose voice now carried weight in the highest circles of the province. Not long after, a Venetian merchant visited the region, dazzling the nobility with silks, spices, and tales of distant lands. Jean observed how the nobles fawned over these tokens of sophistication, desperate to appear cosmopolitan in the eyes of their peers. Jean adapted quickly. He began to wear a discreet velvet sash, a gift from an uncle in Venice. He commissioned a local craftsman to make a signet ring set with colored glass and a stylized bee. He learned a handful of Italian greetings and peppered his conversation with mentions of trade and art from the wider world. These details worked wonders. The minor aristocrats, hungry for novelty, became eager to claim Jean as a friend. Rumors spread that the Beaumont family had deep ties to the merchant cities of the South, connections that would bring prosperity to the whole region. In truth, Jean had little more than a few clever purchases and a quick tongue, but the illusion of cosmopolitan elegance cemented his place in local society and made his legend even more difficult to challenge. Behind the grandeur and ritual of noble life, Jean discovered a secret. The bureaucracy that sustained the social order was chaotic, inconsistent, and ripe for manipulation. Records were incomplete, archives lost to war or neglect, and few officials could recall the details of a distant family tree. Clerks made mistakes, documents were copied, amended, or lost altogether. Jean learned how to navigate these gaps. He studied how to file petitions, how to request copies of missing grants, and how to reference royal decrees no one could actually produce. Whenever a challenge arose, he presented his papers, knowing that the mere appearance of legitimacy often sufficed. He realized that most disputes were resolved in quiet rooms, not courtrooms, and that a calm voice and a credible document could settle matters before anyone asked difficult questions. It became clear, the true power lay not in blood or birth, but in understanding and exploiting the system's weaknesses. Jean was no longer merely pretending. He had become the embodiment of the very order he once envied from afar. Word of Jean's remarkable talents and connections began to travel far beyond his provincial home. One day, a formal letter arrived, a summons to Paris, the heart of royal authority. The city was a whirlwind, spires of stone, streets teeming with merchants and beggars, echoes of power and rumor in every shadow. Jean arrived dressed in his best, still modest by Parisian standards, but with an undeniable air of refinement. He was brought before a group of royal officials, each more skeptical than the last. The meeting was less a conversation and more an interrogation. Questions about lineage, property, old alliances, and the tragedies of war. Jean answered with practiced humility, never offering too much detail, but never faltering under scrutiny. He invoked the chaos of recent decades as the reason for missing documents, cited the destruction of archives during the plague, and mourned family lost to conflict. His restraint, his carefully measured sadness, and his subtle suggestions of noble suffering found their mark. After hours of questioning, a senior advisor finally smiled. Many men have come to Paris seeking favor. Few have spoken so simply and left us with so much to ponder. Jean's name was quietly added to the list of recognized gentlemen, and the doors to Parisian society creaked open. Paris was a city of factions. Nobles, merchants, clerics, and royal favorites all jockeyed for influence. Here, alliances could shift overnight, and the unwary could be ruined by a whisper. Jean navigated this world with caution and grace. He never took sides openly, but became a confidant to all, listening far more than he spoke. When disputes erupted, he offered solutions that flattered both parties and avoided hard promises. He became known as a peacemaker, a man who could see both sides. Sometimes he resolved land disputes by quoting long-forgotten laws, other times by arranging marriages or trade agreements. His ability to understand people's hidden motives and to play to their vanity or fear quickly made him indispensable. In these smoky halls and candlelit chambers, Jean found the real currency of power: information, trust, and the illusion of neutrality. With each passing week, his web of contacts grew deeper and stronger. He was no longer just an outsider with a story. He was now a player in the capital's great game. Jean's success did not go unnoticed by the crown. After mediating a particularly bitter quarrel between two noble houses, he was granted a modest estate in Picardy, official recognition of his value to the realm. Suddenly, the boy from a mill had become a lord in his own right. The estate was small but fertile, its manor house humble but defensible. Jean set about restoring it, hiring local workers, hosting gatherings, and dispensing fair judgment in disputes. To the peasants, he was a curious blend of compassion and authority. To neighboring nobles, he was a new arrival worth befriending or watching closely. For Jean, this was the summit he had imagined on long, hungry nights as a child: land, respect, and a seat at the table. He walked the fields at dawn, savoring the quiet, and wondered how long such good fortune could last. No ascent goes unnoticed for long. As Jean's influence grew, so did whispers among the Parisian elite. Some noted inconsistencies in his family stories. Others wondered why no one could remember his parents or the details of his childhood. A few jealous rivals began to probe, hiring clerks to comb old parish records and sending letters to distant towns. At social gatherings, questions became more pointed. "Remind me, dear Jean, which branch of the Beaumonts was your father again?" Or, "You must remember the winter of '66 in Picardy, no?" Jean responded with his usual mix of charm and artful vagueness, but in private, he began to feel the pressure. He spent nights revising his stories, practicing dates and names, filling in gaps that might one day be exposed. He knew that the higher one rises, the more the world looks for a reason to drag you down. It was at a grand feast, thrown in honor of the king's advisor, that Jean's world began to unravel. Among the guests was a young priest, recently arrived from Normandy, Arnaud de Sèvres. The priest watched Jean intently throughout the evening, then approached him as the crowd thinned. "You look familiar," he said softly. "Did you ever live near the old mill by the river?" Jean's heart skipped. For a moment, old memories threatened to flood his carefully built defenses. He smiled, deflecting the question, but Arnaud persisted, recalling details no outsider could know. That night, for the first time in years, Jean could not sleep. He realized that no matter how convincing the mask, there was always a chance someone from the past could see through it. Arnaud began to ask questions of others, seeking out documents and parish records, piecing together the truth behind the legend of Jean de Beaumont. The stage was set for the greatest test of Jean's life, not against the nobility or the bureaucracy, but against the inescapable power of his own past. Arnaud de Sèvres was not a man easily dismissed. After the feast, he quietly but persistently began his search for the truth. He visited old acquaintances in Normandy, tracked down church records, and spoke with elders who remembered the miller's son who vanished years ago. In Paris, Arnaud petitioned the local clergy and even contacted minor officials, asking pointed questions about Jean de Beaumont's origins. At first, the nobles and townsfolk brushed off his inquiries as harmless curiosity, but Arnaud's conviction was unwavering. Piece by piece, he assembled a portrait that contradicted the carefully woven legend. He found signatures in the notary's ledger, matching Jean's hand. He uncovered baptismal records for a Jacques Arnay, dated perfectly to Jean's supposed birth. A web of inconsistencies began to emerge, and the first rumors reached the ears of the court. Pressure mounted as a formal investigation was launched. Church officials and royal archivists began poring over documents, family trees, property deeds, parish rolls. Discrepancies appeared everywhere. Some seals were too new. Some signatures varied from document to document. Some family histories failed to match any known line. The more the authorities examined Jean's papers, the less sense they made. Witnesses contradicted one another. Stories changed under questioning. The officials became increasingly suspicious, not just of Jean, but of the whole process that allowed him to rise so high, so fast. Behind closed doors, the question was whispered: if he isn't who he claims to be, who is he? And how did we let him in? Summoned to answer before a council of nobles, churchmen, and scribes, Jean stood at the center of a grand hall. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, hungry for a scandal worthy of the city's endless appetite for drama. Jean was calm, dignified, but the old ease was gone. As the questions began, some gentle, some pointed, he relied on the stories he had polished for years. But this time, the council had evidence, signatures to compare, witnesses to contradict him, and the persistent, piercing gaze of Arnaud de Sèvres. Under pressure, Jean struggled to maintain the web. His answers grew shorter. Inconsistencies crept in. Finally, Arnaud rose, holding aloft the notary's ledger and baptismal record. This is the boy from Normandy, not the son of a noble, but of a miller. The room erupted in murmurs and accusations. Jean stood silent, caught between his legend and his reality. In the aftermath, Jean's supporters melted away. The nobility, eager to protect their own reputations, quickly distanced themselves. Banished from court, stripped of his estate, Jean found himself a pariah in the very world he had so skillfully conquered. For days, Paris buzzed with gossip. Some marveled at his cunning, others spat in disgust. A few, in secret, admitted admiration, for hadn't he shown the weakness of the system and the power of the individual will? But for Jean, there was no triumph, only isolation. The wealth, the friends, the honor, all gone in an instant. Only the echo of his own story remained, reverberating through empty halls and behind closed doors. The council faced a dilemma. How do you punish a man who exposed the vulnerabilities of your world? Public execution would only draw attention to their gullibility. Instead, the verdict was exile, not just from Paris, but from history itself. Jean de Beaumont, once the toast of the nobility, was consigned to a remote monastery. He was forbidden from writing letters, stripped of all titles, and left to live out his days in silence and contemplation. Official records were altered or erased, and for most, his name became a cautionary tale or a ghost story. Yet the legend of the miller's son who dared to dream bigger than his birth could not be entirely destroyed. In quiet corners, in whispers and rumors, the story would survive. The man who proved that even in a world built on blood and paper, a single act of daring could change everything. Exile to the monastery was a punishment more subtle and in some ways more brutal than death. Jean was ordered to renounce his titles, surrender all evidence of his invented life, and take a vow of silence regarding his past. Monks were instructed to keep no record of his presence beyond a single, unremarkable entry. A brother arrived, seeking forgiveness. His name was scrubbed from court documents. Portraits disappeared. In the eyes of official history, Jean de Beaumont never existed. Yet behind the monastery walls, Jean could not erase the memories. Each morning, he saw the rise and fall of his journey flash before him, from miller's son to master of masks, to a man stripped of all but his thoughts. Life in the monastery was stark and silent. No courtly intrigue, no dazzling banquets, only prayer, work, and reflection. Jean, now simply Brother Jacques, spent his days tending the garden and his nights alone in a cold stone cell. The monks were polite but distant. They knew little of his story and cared less. His fame and infamy had no currency here. Slowly, Jean adjusted to the rhythms of the cloister. He found a certain peace in anonymity, in the discipline of simple labor, and the certainty that, for once, his actions would not be questioned or doubted. But even in solitude, he sometimes wondered, did any trace of his legend remain? Did anyone somewhere remember the story that almost changed the world? Legends say that during these years, Jean began to write a secret memoir, a confession, a record, a warning. In careful Latin, hidden in the margins of prayer books or tucked within the bindings of other volumes, he described his early life, his rise, his methods, his regrets. He wrote not for revenge or redemption, but to capture the fragile truth of his existence before it vanished forever. A few fragments of this manuscript survived, passages about the power of observation, the weakness of systems, the loneliness of wearing so many faces. Some say the monks destroyed the rest. Others believe the pages are still hidden in some forgotten archive, waiting to be discovered. The monarchy and the church had strong reasons to bury Jean's story. To admit the truth would mean acknowledging that anyone, even a miller's son, could become a noble with the right combination of cunning and circumstance. Instead, the official version held, there was no impostor, no scandal, only a minor clerical error that had been quietly corrected. Families who had once claimed kinship with the Beaumonts became silent. Even those who had admired Jean's wit and intellect now spoke of him as a warning, not a model. Yet the story could not be entirely suppressed. It persisted in jokes among scribes, in anxious murmurs in the corridors of power, and in the knowing glances of those who recognized how close the world had come to being fooled. Centuries later, as scholars pored over yellowed manuscripts in dusty libraries, odd references to a Lord Beaumont or a mysterious impostor began to appear. A few curious historians dug deeper, piecing together the echoes of Jean's tale. A birth record here, a forged deed there, a scandalous trial mentioned in a priest's diary. Victorian writers, ever fascinated by the romance of lost identities and secret lives, spun new stories around the legend. Jean's life became inspiration for novels, plays, and philosophical debates about the nature of status, merit, and truth. Even as the facts faded, the questions he raised remained. How fragile is the social order? Who gets to decide who we are, and could it happen again? With the rediscovery of Jean's story, historians began to debate. Was his case unique or just the most famous? Some pointed to other mysterious figures in European history, claimants to lost titles, found heirs, who appeared just in time to inherit fortunes, or forgotten relatives restored by convenient documents. Perhaps Jean de Beaumont was not the only one, but simply the boldest, the one whose story was too grand, too disruptive to fully erase. Others saw him as a symptom of the times. In a world shaken by war, plague, and social upheaval, cracks appeared in even the most rigid systems. And when cracks appear, someone always tries to slip through. The more scholars looked, the more stories they found. There was Perkin Warbeck, who claimed the English throne as the lost prince, Anna Anderson, who convinced some that she was Russia's missing Grand Duchess, whole waves of false Dimitris in Poland and Russia, each with their own forged credentials and desperate followers. Across the centuries, these impostors shared common traits: sharp minds, adaptability, and a keen understanding of what others wanted to believe. Like Jean, they exposed the weaknesses of their societies and the hunger for hope or novelty in uncertain times. Jean's legend thus became part of a wider tradition, the perennial figure who reminds us that identity can be both armor and illusion. Jean's success was not just a matter of skill, but of timing. In periods of crisis, when war, disease, or corruption undermine faith in the old order, people are ready to accept new stories. They crave heroes, or at least convincing solutions, and are often willing to overlook inconsistencies if the alternative is despair. Jean offered the appearance of continuity, of noble suffering redeemed. He soothed the fears of the elite by reflecting their own values back at them, wrapped in the trappings of tragedy and perseverance. His scam succeeded because it met a need for hope, for order, for reassurance that the world still made sense. Details matter. Jean did not rely on grand gestures or wild claims. He learned the dialects, the local histories, the little customs that set one village apart from the next. His clothes were always appropriate, never flashy, his manners impeccable. He listened more than he spoke, remembered names and favors, and used silence to deflect suspicion. Above all, he projected confidence, not arrogance, but the quiet certainty of a man who belonged. Those who met him found it easier to believe the lie than to admit they had been fooled. Medieval society prided itself on its strict boundaries, lords and peasants, clerics and laymen, each in their ordained place. Yet Jean's story exposed how porous those boundaries could be, how easily a determined outsider might slip past the guards, the laws, and even the memories of those in power. For all the talk of bloodlines and tradition, the reality was far more fragile. All it took was one man with enough nerve and skill to show that the whole system rested on perception, and that sometimes perception could be changed with nothing more than a forged seal and a steady gaze. For the nobles and officials who welcomed Jean, there was always a risk in probing too deeply. To question his story was to risk embarrassing oneself, to risk being seen as rude, paranoid, or, worst of all, ignorant of one's own family trees. No one wanted to be the first to doubt or to admit they'd been fooled. The cost of error was too high. Loss of face, loss of alliances, even loss of position. So a polite conspiracy formed, a collective willingness to let things be, as long as the illusion remained unchallenged. Jean's presence became a secret everyone shared, and his success was built as much on their fear as on his skill. At its core, Jean's rise was not just about a clever individual, but about a system eager to believe its own stories. The nobility, desperate to preserve the appearance of continuity after war and plague, wanted new blood as much as it feared it. They chose to embrace Jean, to fill the empty seats at their tables, to reinforce the narrative of order restored. In doing so, they blinded themselves to warning signs, preferring a well-spoken, well-dressed impostor to the discomfort of admitting the cracks in their world. Jean was not just a symptom. He was a mirror, reflecting a society that would rather deceive itself than confront its own fragility. After Jean's exposure, the authorities faced a delicate dilemma. To punish him too harshly would be to admit the depth of their own mistake and perhaps encourage sympathy for a clever underdog. Worse, a public execution could provoke mockery, scandal, or even inspire imitators. Instead, they chose silence, erasing his name, removing him quietly from view, and rewriting records to minimize the embarrassment. The church favored forgiveness and retreat. The crown preferred a swift end to the affair, and the nobility, keen to move on, closed ranks around a new, carefully vetted narrative. Little is known about the fate of Jean's actual relatives. Some stories claim his family was questioned and then left in peace. Others say they fled to another region under assumed names. A few suggest that distant cousins benefited from the confusion, quietly inheriting property or marrying into minor noble families. But for most, the association with the infamous impostor meant a lifetime of suspicion or anonymity. The world of power is unforgiving to those whose names are tainted, even if they themselves played no role in the drama. Official history tried to erase Jean, but the people remembered. In villages and taverns, stories grew. The clever peasant who outwitted the lords, the trickster who became a noble, the man who nearly turned the world upside down. Some made him a villain, others a hero, but all agreed he had shown that greatness could come from anywhere, and that the rules of society were more flexible than anyone cared to admit. His legend survived in songs, jokes, and fireside tales. Parents warned their children, "Don't trust a stranger with too perfect manners," while dreamers whispered, "If he did it, why not us?" In the end, Jean became more than a man. He became a symbol of possibility and danger, forever haunting the border between truth and fiction. Some believe that during his silent years in the monastery, Jean de Beaumont secretly wrote down his thoughts and confessions. While no complete manuscript has ever been found, scattered fragments and rumored quotations have surfaced in private collections and forgotten libraries. One fragment reads, "Men bow to seals and titles, but they kneel even lower before certainty. I gave them certainty, and they crowned me for it." Another, "To wear a mask is to see how many others do the same." Whether these lines are authentic or apocryphal, they added to the mystique, turning Jean from a historical anomaly into a philosopher of imposture, a man who saw through the world's disguises and left his own for others to find. The shock of Jean's unmasking sent ripples through the noble courts of France and beyond. Suddenly, everyone was suspicious. Nobles scrutinized each other's pedigrees, hired genealogists, and imposed stricter rules for proof of lineage. The king's advisors issued new decrees on the use of seals and the storage of documents. For a time, rumors of new impostors multiplied. Every outsider was eyed with distrust. Every clever newcomer became the subject of gossip. Ironically, Jean's exposure did not restore faith in the system. It exposed its weaknesses even further. The panic faded, but the scars remained. In the decades that followed, many a minor noble was quietly investigated, and the memory of the Beaumont affair became a cautionary tale in the corridors of power. Modern psychologists and historians agree, Jean's greatest weapon was not his forgeries, but his ability to control first impressions. He understood that people, especially those in power, are drawn to confidence, polish, and the subtle cues of belonging. A well-chosen phrase, a carefully timed gesture, a willingness to listen. These made Jean seem right long before anyone asked for proof. His story became a classic example of confirmation bias, the tendency to see what we expect and ignore